I'm Mark Urban-Lorraine, and on behalf of the STEM Teaching Essentials Steering Committee, Kendra Chavella, Kelly Mellenbaugh, Corey Feda-Hartley, and Suzanne Lang, who is in absentia today, we'd like to thank you for coming. We have 2 more workshops coming up in our series, the theme of which is built around backward design this year. And so it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Tammy Long, who is an assistant professor in plant biology, or have you changed your name over there, or is it plant something else now?
No, we're plant biology.
You're still plant biologists over there. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, we're sticking to it.
I've known Tammy for a while.
Yes, we have.
And Tammy, in addition to having a lot of experience teaching using a lot of active learning techniques in large classrooms, which is why we're here today, does research on student modeling and use of models in biology classes in her laboratory. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Tammy Long. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so thank you. I see a lot of folks here that don't need this workshop because I've worked with many of you in the past and I know what kinds of wonderful things you do in your classrooms. So I question whether this will be of use to those of you who I consider expert to my abilities. But let's get started by having just a few minutes I'd like you to talk about this question. We have a couple of slides that are going to get snipped off at the top, and we've tried a couple of other workarounds. It looks like we're not going to be able to remedy that. But the question is, what is it exactly that makes large classes so challenging? So how about 2 or 3 minutes, chat with your neighbor, and let's hear what you guys have to say. Okay, so how about if we have a couple of individuals give us some feedback, and I understand that Kelly is going to mic the speakers. So would anyone like to offer what you discussed with your neighbors? What are the things that you find challenging about big classes?
Throw your hand up.
There's a lot of conversation for no one volunteering. Okay, she's going to come to you next. Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
You're good. It's to him.
Oh, okay. So I would say the biggest hurdle in large classes is the grading effort if you don't have anyone helping you out with this.
Perfect.
So,
okay, I agree. Curtis had something also?
Sorry for everybody knocking on the back of your chairs.
No, I think the biggest problem is when you have like 250 to 400 students is that it's so large they don't really feel connected to you, right? The people in the back third or half of the class don't really feel involved.
I have been in classrooms where you actually cannot see the faces of the students at the back. Yeah, that's very disconcerting. So, other ideas? Right behind you, Kelly.
We talked about getting students to participate in questions. Getting them to actually raise their hand is challenging.
Yep. Other ideas?
Coming through.
Probably other groups said this too, but we haven't mentioned that it's much more difficult to have a rapport with students as individuals in a large class.
So similar to what Curtis was mentioning about not feeling connected to the instructor. Okay. Yeah. We'll get like 2 more and then we'll move on.
Part of my problem is like the wonky technology. So if you're in a room and the mic goes out, or how do you project things out to people, make it available so that they can actually see it? Your laptop goes on the fritz mid-class, and that's been really challenging for me.
Right, because that always makes you look really smart and in control when you, Yep. Yes, it gives you that authority in the classroom, right? It doesn't matter, it's the perception, right?
One challenge I have is that if you are trying to actively engage the students in doing work during class, so I teach math, if I have them working on problems, it's hard to get to the students who are not engaging with it. So it's hard to physically, for me, to get to students who are sort of in the middle, back of the room. And it's hard just in terms of the numbers to get to all the students that need help in a short amount of time.
Agreed. And John, you had one?
Well,
You'll have the last word.
It actually plays off what what was just said, that if you get the students to ask questions, if you have 250 students and they all ask a question, you can't possibly answer them all.
Yep.
But the other thing then is, if you're trying to have the students interact with each other, there's several challenges. Oftentimes the classrooms are not set up well to do it, and the students often don't want to. They're sitting in these big classrooms like over there, and there's one over there, and there's one over there. So,
Yep.
so challenges of both, getting to the students and getting them to interact with each other, and then answering all their questions if you have them doing something active. So.
Agreed. Okay. So those are all great ideas. It looks like we have one more to close off the session at the back there. One person wants to add one more thing.
Thank you. I may speak a little bit differently than the others. I like to speak from the student perspective. As a student, to be honest with you, the size of the class didn't bother me. And sometimes I even feel there's more flexibility from the large class, because for the small class, there's no way to escape. For the big class, if it's boring, I can just do my own stuff.
Well,
Thank you.
Okay, so if you're a student who wants to escape in the class, that could be a problem for the instructor if you actually care to engage them. So, so these ideas were some of the things that I've heard in the past, and of course things that I've encountered myself. And so I've organized these into kind of three big bins that I think about when I collectively think about what are the challenges. So when I was trying to put together some ideas here, I was thinking, what are the big problem areas? So you guys have hit on many of these. So there's the engagement factor. Some of you talked about connecting with students, keeping them on task, making sure that they have access to resources or ability to ask and answer questions. There is the assessment challenge. We'll spend a significant amount of time talking about some techniques that we've adapted for managing assessing in large class settings. And then there's also just the general management factor. So these are kind of the organizing concepts that I'm thinking about. It's not exactly the outline of what I have planned, but these are kind of the principles behind the ideas that I've put together. So we're calling this discussion here, downsizing your classroom. I think I might have actually offered a different title when I submitted it, but the idea of taking a big class and trying to make the experience feel like a smaller class context. So I do have a couple of more questions for you. I'd like you to think about. I have two questions. How many of you, just by show of hands, believe this statement or accept this as true, that if you had a smaller class, you think your students would probably learn more? So a couple hands. And by the way, let me ask, how many of you are actually teaching a large class right now or have taught large classes in the past? Because some of you might be here because you have not had the experience and want to prepare for it. So a majority of you have or are teaching large classes. And what is large? 300? 490? 200? What is? 200 is too much? Okay. Over 50, 60? Yep. I've been in workshops with folks that are in writing and rhetoric who said that they couldn't do these assessments because they're so demanding. There's so many students, and they were talking about 22 students in the class. So I guess it depends on your perspective and what you're asking of your students. Maybe 22 is a lot if you're doing a lot of writing. I can see that could be very burdensome. So a couple of you agreed that if your class was smaller, that your students probably would learn more. So I just wanted to mention that people have done investigations, they have done research about exploring the impacts of class size, and the data are actually quite mixed. There isn't a clear consensus about this. So there's kind of a mix of findings. And there aren't a ton of studies either. There are enough that there is a body of literature out there. But you have to really pay attention in terms of your interpretation of whether you accept the finding or not. Thinking about it in terms of how are they actually measuring learning. So in many cases, you might find that the standard or the metric that they're using for their assessment of learning is a student's perception about how much they think they've learned. And that may or may not correspond with actual learning gains. So we want to consider that in this. What we do find, though, is that more importantly than class size is that other factors have much stronger predictive value. And one of the things that emerges as a very strong predictor is instructional approach. And what I mean here is thinking about what the students are actually doing in the context of the class, not necessarily what the instructor is doing, but how has the instructor designed the experience for the students and what kinds of activities are they engaged in. That emerges as a much stronger predictor. How about this question? If your class was smaller, you would assess more critical thinking skills? Would this enable you to do that? I see a lot of you agreeing to this. Okay, so how many of you know Bloom's taxonomy? It is not the greatest tool, but it's the one that you're most likely to know about. But if you've never heard of it, and if you have and just need a very brief refresher, Bloom's taxonomy is an organizational scheme for classifying assessment questions based on the type of cognitive level that they reflect. So you can design a question that's asking you to assess a bit of factual knowledge, and that requires the cognitive skill of being able to recall or recollect that fact. You can also design questions that ask you to evaluate multiple sources of information, and that requires a different cognitive skill. It's not important that we know a lot about Bloom's for this. We're not going to talk about Bloom's at all. But I wanted to show you some data on that question about the relationship between assessing higher level cognitive skills and class size. And I was part of this study we published in 2010. We actually collected assessments from about 100 or so instructors across 44 institutions, I believe, close to 10,000 items that we rated for Bloom level, and we evaluated the items for the relationship or the correlation to class size. And what we found here is obviously there was no relationship whatsoever. This was true across institution types as well. So in this sample, we included both undergraduate institutions, R1s, comprehensives. So there's a diversity of institution types, and what we find is that in general, this set also was reflective of the type of courses that I teach here and my cohorts and colleagues do as well, intro bio. So across intro bio classes nationally, we did not find a correlation, even though everyone says if my class was smaller, I would assess better. So we just don't find that to be borne out. So that's kind of my context or background. So my objective for today is just to share with you some tips, tricks, strategies that I've accumulated over the years. Some of them they're all organized around those 3 principles that I mentioned at the beginning that kind of emerged from your early discussion. These are ways that I envision that we can enhance student engagement, that we can improve our ability to assess, and also to reduce our workload. So that's really what we're after here. So this is not going to be a deep philosophical kind of conversation. It's not going to be very theory-based. I also want to qualify, I will give you a couple of caveats for everything else that I'm going to say today. Everything that I'm going to talk about I have actually done. So I promise that they have been field tested at least with a sample size of 1. Most of them have some grounding in learning theory, but we're not going to talk about that too much. So there is some basis for a rationale for why one might engage in these strategies, particularly those that are related to assessment and organization of students. Some are borrowed or stolen from people who teach brilliantly, and then I've adopted those strategies. So I have recklessly stolen from them in places. I'll try to remember to give credit where I recall. Some days and semesters, these things work out really well, and other times, the very same technique just doesn't bear out. So there is that factor. So I want to throw that into the mix too. And I will not guarantee any success in transferring this to another context. And I threw that one in because the last time I gave this workshop, there was someone in the audience who said, you know, I've been coming to your workshops for a couple years now, and I do all the things that you say that we should do, and it just fails miserably every time. So I hope that won't be the case for you. And that's not what I'm trying for, but I just want to share things that have worked out for me. I think that many people could leverage the same tools. But like I said, no guarantees. All right, so here's the organizational structure that I'm going to propose for how we go through this, and I welcome any interruptions along the way or questions for clarification. So I'm pretty flexible about how we do this. But the way that I'm envisioning this is I want to give you some ideas for things that can be done to kind of set the tone and establish the organizational structure of the class, because this helps us promote efficiency. And behind every suggestion is intentionally, it's designed to help reduce your workload, believe it or not. So So let's talk about setting the tone and establishing ground rules. And then I'll have quite a bit of things that I can share with you about managing assessment. So designing and how to execute those and managing the logistics of it. And then finally, if we have time, and we may not, depending on the nature of discussion, I thought it would be fun to share some affordances of large classes, because we're accustomed to talking about how difficult it is to teach large classes and all the challenges. But there are some instances in which having a large class allows you to do some things that you can't do in a small class. And so I'd like to talk to you about some of those things that we've experimented with and that we're toying with in the development of the intro bio sequence. Does that sound okay? Okay, all right, let's go. All right, so let's start. I've got 3 tools that I want to share with you that help me at the beginning to kind of set the tone and organize how the class is going to go. And I'm going to give credit here because many of these come from one of my friends and colleagues, Diane Eber-May. She's assembled some of these ideas together in a book called Pathways to Scientific Teaching. The citation is at the bottom of the slide, so if you guys collect the slides later, you'll have the full citation. It looks like we're cropped on both the top and bottom here. So some of the ideas are originally hers, some are borrowed from other colleagues, some I developed. Okay, so let's start with the first item, groups. Almost everything that I'm going to talk about today has a group-related basis to it. When I teach intro bio, my class sizes now are about 200. They used to be as much as 500, so everything that I'm going to tell you has been done in the context of a 500 as well as a 200 classroom. I'm a big believer in groups, so groups kind of underlie a lot of what we do. Now, it is not my intent that we spend a lot of time talking about the rationale for groups. How many of you use groups in your large classes? About half of you, it looks like, have done some work in the context of groups, and I'm sure that varies. So I don't think that I have to spend too much time rationalizing this, but increasingly, the ability to demonstrate the ability to work cooperatively in a team context is of value, both to future employers, I'm noticing now when I'm filling out evaluations and recommendations for students that are applying for medical school or pharmacy school, I'm being asked, how good are they in the context of a team? So these skills are increasingly becoming important, and I think students are starting to recognize it. I've noticed over the last maybe 5 or so years, less resistance from my students about working in teams than what I used to experience. So why do we do groups? Well, one is because we all have this kid in the class, right? He usually sits about right there, and you can't escape. And we want to share the experience. We want others to have the chance to actually interact in the class too and not have everything directed at that individual. We also use groups because we know that not all the students are on task. Some of them are doing that thing that you mentioned. They're escaping into the world of Facebook or shopping on Amazon. So we've seen some amazing shoe shopping going on in the classroom. They do have excellent taste, so I'll give you that. So we want to keep students on task, and organizing at the level of groups helps to increase some level of accountability. So in groups, when we work students in groups, everybody gets a chance to speak. So in the context of the big class, if it's just me one-on-one with another student, only a very small subset of students are actually going to offer up their ideas and thoughts. I'm only going to engage in a minimal number of conversations. Everybody also gets to get heard. And that's important not just for validation and feeling like you have something to say, but I think one really important role in the groups is if a student thinks that they might have an answer or they might have a discussion point that they want to share, there's a lot of nervousness that might be happening in the class size of a couple hundred students, and you want to have a chance to vet your thinking. How about if I bounce this idea off of you first and you tell me if this sounds stupid before I say it in front of 200 people? So you have a chance to kind of practice that thinking. We can also use the groups as a way to kind of monitor accountability. So frequently in a class, I'm going to turn the discussion back to the groups. And if the students have been shopping for shoes on Amazon, suddenly they're in this position of, oh my gosh, what are we supposed to be doing? So the groups are going to get annoyed with them after a while. You know, you guys have to stay on task. We've got something that we have to do now. So it helps promote that accountability. Okay, so in terms of thinking, so that's the affordances for the students, but for me as the instructor and in the interest of the timekeeping that we said that we want to go after, groups are my first line of defense for a lot of the questions that are not the interesting questions that you want to engage with the students about. I love getting questions from students about content. They're wrestling with something that they're having a difficult time understanding. They want to know about more examples of some concept. They want to unpack their thinking with me. I love those questions. But I do not love the ones when they say, I had to miss class today. Did I miss anything? Was there anything I need to know? What are we supposed to be working on? And for the ones that were shopping for shoes, and then suddenly there's an activity, wait, what's a nucleotide? Those kinds of things can be offloaded to the peer groups. They can manage that, and it saves a tremendous amount of time in email traffic. For me, the groups are also a structural unit for how we administer and manage just the general logistics of the class. I'm going to show you some very specific examples of exactly what that looks like in just a bit. And I also use them quite a bit for as a unit of analysis for some graded work, particularly feedback, formative assessment. So if I say formative assessment, are we okay with that term? Or yes? Okay, good. See, I'm having to explain many fewer things than in the past. You guys are doing a great job with the workshop series. Everybody's coming highly educated about these things. So groups are really central and important, so I mentioned that. So now let's segue to how we kind of structure and organize the groups here and how we get that set up. And that brings me to my second tool here, and that is the use of folders. And again, I'm going to credit Diane Abermay for, I'm not sure if she actually came up with this or if she thinks she came up with this, because she's had these conversations with lots of people over many years. So, but anyway, she's written about it in that Pathways book that I mentioned. So if you want a full-on description about how this works, she's done that job. So on day one, my imperative is to get students into groups as quickly as possible. So there's a couple of ways for how we can get the students organized into groups, and I'll talk about that in a second. But on the day one, regardless of what mechanism we use, when students come in, the first thing that they're going to get is a folder. They get a blank folder, and it's going to have a couple of slips of paper in it. So they're handed this blank folder, and while they're picking up their folders and finding their way, navigating to a seat in the classroom, this is projected on the screen. It's telling them, it's giving them a set of instructions for what to do with that folder. So I usually have the folders already with their names printed, so they're going to find one that has their name on it. If not, they can add their name. But there's a couple of things that we want them to actually put on the folder. So they're going to put a little fact about themselves, what makes them interesting or unique, where they're from. We also want them to flip the folder upside down and put the name that they like to be referred to as on that and write it really big. And then this thing in the corner, constructive and destructive behaviors, that's one of those sheets of paper inside the folder. So let me show you what that is. And I recognize the print may be a little small. So this will be included in the notes that are shared after the workshop if you want to see it more closely. This is a resource that I got from the Wisconsin Program for Scientific Teaching, and they use this for promoting effective group dynamics. It's a list of behaviors or personality characteristics that are associated with positive group behaviors and negative group behaviors. And so part of what we're asking the students to do on this folder is identify one from each column that is you, and fess up to it and put it on the folder. So as I'm looking at this, I know where I am on this. Constructive behavior, I'm a clarifier. I want to make sure I'm understanding what's going on, and I want to make sure everybody else is understanding what we're trying to accomplish in a group. But in terms of my destructive behavior, I also know I'm a withdrawer. So if things are kind of going astray or not the way that I like, I'm likely to sit back and stop engaging. So I admit that outright. So the students have done, they've seen these instructions on the screen, and when they're finished, what they have is a folder that looks something like this. So their name is on it, they have a little bit of information. Oh, I usually save a corner and let the students vote for what they want, you know, what other piece of information you want. So this one actually, somebody nominated a spirit animal one year. Said, let's do, I didn't know what a spirit animal was. So we did that. So this is for Chuck's folder here. And what they're going to do with this folder, the folder actually serves multiple purposes. And one of them can be to facilitate group formation. So students have put all this together in the few minutes that they're sitting as they're waiting for class to begin. You can use this then as an icebreaker. You can have students turn to their neighbor and use the folder to share information and start a conversation. You can do that a couple of times and already, two rounds of introductions and you've got a group of 4. That's the size group that I typically use, so I'm always after groups of 4. The other thing that you can do with the groups is, for many years, I chose not to form groups on the first day, and I was operating from the principle I wanted students to interact with lots of people in the class and then commit to the people that they really wanted to work with. So I'd set a deadline about 2 weeks out. I'd use the folders as a way for them to break the ice and to meet a couple of students in class, and I'd do that every time we had class for the first couple weeks. And say by the end of the second week, they had to commit to 3 other people that they did want to work with the rest of the semester. More recently, the technique I've converged on, and it seems a little more efficient, is I'm using a tool called CatMe. Have any of you used that as a way to organize a couple? So this is an online resource. It has been free. There was threat of charging for a licensing fee, but it hasn't been enforced yet, to my knowledge. As of last semester anyway, it hasn't been. But this is a wonderful tool that was developed by some engineers at Purdue. It actually came out of that group. And it's an online survey tool. You can sign up as an instructor for an account, and you can design a survey that will be sent to your students that are enrolled in your class. They take the survey, and it will use algorithms that it has developed that is based on research on cooperative learning to form what it conceives are the most effective groups. Now you also have power over the questions as well. So you can use the default quiz that they have, and that works quite well. You can also include additional questions or survey items that you want to be considered in group formation. So for example, one that I add in that I find useful is I started including questions that ask students to tell me about their expertise with different types of tools or abilities, skills. So I'll ask, rate your proficiency with Excel. How good of a writer do you think you are? Are you fearful of technology? So a couple of those kinds of questions that I'll use because I want the groups to have a mix of expertises within the group. You can also have groups form on the basis of schedule. So I also teach a different class. It's a much smaller class in some semesters where we do a lot of field trips. And being able to coordinate travel is really important. So I'll have students organize groups around people that have vehicles and have common schedules so that they can make it to the field trips. So this is a great tool. I strongly advocate it. Yeah, Philip.
Algorithm is diversity.
The research does show that heterogeneous groups are more effective in general. So it does play to heterogeneity in general. However, it will also consider that there are some instances where you might opt for a more homogeneous situation on some characters. So for example, what it won't do is it won't put a single female in with 3 males in a group. Or it does try to create some camaraderie across some demographic variables if there's enough in the data set to allow it. So if you have minority students, you might have pairs of minority students in groups rather than an individual alone. So it does consider those factors as well. But in general, the principle is heterogeneity. Diverse experiences, diverse backgrounds. Good? Okay. All right. So on this day 1, as soon as the groups are formed, the first task of the groups at the very beginning of the semester is that they have to form a contract. And I'm going to show you a picture of what that looks like in a moment. But in this, they declare their own identity, so they're going to choose a group name that's going to define them, and they're going to complete a contract. And the important criteria about the contract is, I know that this is probably not legible here or not readable because the print is very tiny, but I wanted you to see what the form actually really looks like. There are 2 areas that the groups together are going to work on and set ground rules for themselves. So in this form, and again, I didn't develop this. This is borrowed from Deb Allen at she was at University of Delaware at the time. So she developed this tool, and there are a couple of ground rules that we set, and they're very minimal and they're very baseline. We expect students are going to come to class prepared and on time, and we're going to insist that people respect one another. So that's the basis of my ground rules for them. They decide on additional ground rules for themselves. And what we encourage them to discuss when they're adding these ground rules to the contract is that they really consider carefully how they're going to communicate with one another. Because it does seem that over the years, the critical failures of many groups usually has an underlying source of being a failed communication strategy. So somebody gets annoyed because so-and-so didn't do their work, it didn't get it submitted on time, but what they didn't realize is that that person was sick, they sent an email, the rest of the group is using text, so the communication pathway is never crossed. So it's silly things like that that can break a group. So we really ask them to consider how are you going to maintain communication. The other area that they have to add, their original contribution here is, okay, so what are you going to do when things start not going well? Because everybody's happy, honeymoon period, you know, initially everybody's excited to meet someone new. But then after you work together for a while, you're going to find places where you're going to kind of rub each other the wrong way. So when things get really bad, what's the first course of action that you're going to do? So they have to come up with a plan for that. If there is a crisis situation or things really become unmanageable or there's a harassing situation, of course that comes to me then. But we want them to come up with a strategy for how are they going to deal with this up front. So be grown-ups, be adults, and think proactively because you know that these issues are going to come up. So they do a team contract. These are the agreements. I have a copy, they maintain a copy, and I'm going to take you back to the folders because we're not done talking about the folders yet. So in the groups, every student has their own folder, and once they have an identity as a group, as a functional group, they get a hanging folder that's going to go in a box. All of the team members' folders are going to stay together in that group folder. At the end of every class, after they've done some work, they're going to put the individual folders in the group folder, and they're going to file them at the front of the class in these boxes. So these boxes go with us. If we have work that is graded and scored and needs to go back to the students, this is how we deliver it back to them. So the next time we come to the class, we bring the folders with us, and the first team member in comes to the front, grabs the group folder, goes and sits down in the place where the group knows that they're going to sit, and then shares the folders with them that way. Any questions about the folder structure? We have a cart. We have a luggage cart, and we stack them on it, yes. So we come trailing with our little luggage cart. Yes?
Have you seen anybody attempt to do this digitally, just in the interest of trees?
Let's see. Well, there is this other phone. Pardon me? I'm sorry. He said, do I know of any instances where someone has attempted to do the equivalent digitally? So there are mechanisms for digital return of scored items, graded exams. I know chemistry is adopting some software tools that will enable that, and I just recently learned of those, so we're probably going to be looking into that. However, there is this other function. And remember, the folders have the student's name on it, so they hang the folders in the classroom so that I can see what their names are. So this, some of you talked about the impersonality and getting lost in the crowd. So the idea behind this is now, if the student has a question or wants to offer a contribution, or if I want to call out on someone, I can call them by name rather than say, yeah, you in the pink sweatshirt. So, okay? Yes?
Do you have any alternatives for that purpose in a classroom where that doesn't work?
Alternatives for?
For the name.
The nameplates?
The name purpose of the folders? Like in theory. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I will confess. I mean, this is better than nothing, right? But even in this is my classroom in my class, but as you can see, even from looking at this from any perspective, I'm not going to be able to see all the folders. I do move around and try to find the names, and sometimes I just have to do that awkward thing. I'm sorry, I can't see your folder. Could you hold it up? Or, you know, point to someone. It's not perfect. If we had the ideal structure, architecture of classrooms, this would be great. But all of us know none of us have any of those classrooms yet. So.
That looks like a nice, I'll take that one.
This one's not bad. This is not bad. This is my second favorite classroom to teach in. This is MPS 1200, which is the new auditorium in Plant Bio, or MPS actually, between Plant Bio and PSS. My favorite, though, is the Kiva in Ericsson. That is the best. So, okay. Any other questions about full? Yes.
Is there any recommendation?
I'm sorry.
Can you wait for the mic for the questions?
I'm sorry. Yes.
Or just repeat the question. Where was the question at?
Right here.
Thank you.
Is there any recommendation about the group number, or is it related to the total number of class, or doesn't matter?
No, the group number is just an arbitrary number that we assign to the groups. So sometimes we list them alphabetically and then just order them 1 through, in a class of 200, I have 50 groups. So we do the numbering just so that they know where to find their group folder, that they put them back in the same place when they refile them.
No, so I mean to ask about that.
Oh, the number of students in a
number of
group.
students in a
Gotcha.
group,
Okay.
sorry.
There are a lot of different ideas about that, and I think that what you want to do is converge on a group number that works for the purposes that you have in your class. What makes sense to you? So I think most of the literature says that groups of 3 and 4 is mostly optimal. There are certainly cases where larger groups are used because the mission for the group is a larger task. Maybe they're involved in a research project where a larger group has more affordances. I personally use 4, and the reason that I like 4 over 3 is I like this idea of pairs of pairs. So within a group, I can have every group working on 2 different things if the task size is small enough that one pair is working on one thing and the other is working on something else. Or I can give them 2 sets of questions and they work on those together, and then they can share the ideas back and forth. So for me, I like this paired structure. So that's why I've gone to 4. Anything else? Okay, so we try to do all this very early. Now, since we're using CatMe and can do the survey before the classes even start, we can do a lot of this organizational structure on day 1 and get this taken care of, and it takes a lot less time than it used to in the past. The other thing that I want to do up front, we're still on this topic of setting the organization and getting the tone right at the beginning of the class, is we assign a homework the very first day of class. And this homework is intended to ameliorate all of those hundreds of emails that you typically get very early in the class that ask you things like, what time is the class? Are we always in this room? What book do we need? All of that sort of thing. So what this particular homework is kind of a quiz, and we organize this online. The questions that the students are asking are actually directed at the syllabus or any other resources that you use to help your students or that you expect your students to be interacting with. So my syllabus is posted online. I use a website, and I'll show you some pages from that, but you'll notice if you just kind of scan through what the nature of some of these questions is, it's intended to get them educated about where are the materials, where are they going to find stuff, make sure you understand how you're going to be graded in this class so that we don't have any misunderstandings about that later in the semester, and what are the general policies. What's the accountability here? So some classes care about attendance, others don't. Some have 5 exams, some have 2. So some say that all of your grade comes from the exams, others say group work matters. So we want them to know all those things up front. So we actually make this as a moderately high stakes quiz that counts. So you get points for doing this and for getting the answers right. We make sure that all the resources are available to them. So here's a page out of my syllabus online. A lot of the typical content that you would expect to see in any syllabus. But one thing that I've added over the years, because of the persistent questions and my want to kind of minimize the impact of that, is I do have an FAQ page. So there are some questions that I absolutely know I'm going to get every single year, regardless of what I do in the classroom on day 1. No matter how many times I explain it, I'm still going to get asked these questions. And even though I have the FAQ page, students are still emailing me, how am I supposed to study for this class? And now, instead of answering that or copying and pasting what I've written 100 times before, I just put in the link. I just say, here you go. Because each of these expands to a fairly lengthy description and as much explanation as I can imagine that they would want to get on the basis of that question. So I present policies as well as rationale for why we do the things we do. Yes, Mark has a question or comment. Okay.
Yeah, a variation on that theme that I've seen some folks use is that if it's in this frequently asked questions or the syllabus and you ask it, you get points off. That usually incentivizes them to look hard.
Whoa, okay. I haven't gotten that mean yet, but maybe. I'm getting kind of crabbier as I get older, so maybe I will start kind of, I don't know. Okay. But I found that this actually has a significantly dramatic impact on the email traffic and that kind of that draining, exhausting bout of questioning that you typically have with your students at the beginning of semesters.
Sorry, my question was for Mark. How does that affect SIR scores?
Interesting question. I don't have a response. The answer to that's on the back.
Very good. Yeah, I'd imagine too that probably some instructors, have that prowess that they can get away with things like that, and others of us that do not. So some of us might get really attacked for that sort of thing. So this is kind of everything that I wanted to tell you about the upfront, the stuff that we do up front to kind of set the tone and get the organization going. We also try to model in that first class period, what is a typical class session going to look like? So I'm a big believer in learning objectives and making sure that they have access to what the course objectives are as well as every class. I am finding, and I think all of you who use learning objectives probably can relate, that students really are not paying attention to what the learning objectives are when you start your class. So I'm including them in my slides and I post notes after class, so I make sure that they're always there. But I've found myself minimizing how much time I spend reviewing those because I know that they're not paying attention. But when they ask me, what should I study? What am I supposed to know for the exam? I point them back to the learning objectives. And then they say, so where are those? And they're the first slide in every note set. So, okay, so let's talk about assessment. If you guys want to move on to a different topic here. Yeah. So we have a question here. Come on, Kelly.
I know.
So if you've got, say juniors in your class, are you seeing that as you're asking them to do this and fill out the stuff for the folders and get them to go through this, that they've seen this in other classes and so they know the routine, or are you having to teach it to the entire class, each time, or is it now enough people doing things like this that at least some part of the classes has the hang of it already?
Few students have seen this or witnessed this because most of us who are doing this, I'm not the only one doing this, but most of us that are doing this are at the intro level. So that means they probably haven't had a series of intro classes. So whatever intro class they're coming into, whether it's John's or mine, they're probably seeing it at that level. So, but there are some that are really put off by this early on. They equate this to being treated like a kindergartner. That's the sort of thing I hear. However, that number is relatively small. Of course, the small number is always the one that gets under my skin and really breaks my heart, of course. Those are the people that get to me. In many cases, they kind of get beyond that as you go along and they realize this really isn't me treating you like a kindergartner. The work that you're gonna do is hardly kindergarten level. So this is just an organizational scheme. So they kind of get over that, usually. Of course, there is always, the ones that go off and write really mean things about you online. They never get over it. So, but that's the worst criticism, usually. Anything else? Okay. So assessment, I know, is a really significant cost in terms of our time and our effort. And it really matters a lot too. So this is the place where a lot of us are being asked to do more than what we have been. We're being asked to do better than what we typically have been, to step up our assessment game. So I think this is a really important area where we can make some difference. So I have a couple of tools that I typically use. I'm gonna tell you about some logistics that I have come across or developed progressively over the years that help increase efficiency. And particularly, I'm also assuming that we have, I know that this is not the case for everyone. We in bio have access to LAs. So we have 1 or 2 undergrads that are given to us by the biology program, by BioSci. And we really make use of the undergraduates in the context of class, and they really contribute a lot to managing the assessment. So I'll tell you how we use those. And finally, a mechanism for contesting grades. So this is to help deal with some of those uncomfortable issues that students always have when they feel that they've been slighted or treated unfairly in the assessment. So just to give you an idea of like the range of how I allocate points, I do change this every single year because I find that I'm always experimenting or tweaking how I design my assessment structure for the class. I haven't found the perfect distribution just yet, but here's the most recent version that I have. I do give credit for in-class work. So every day that the class gets together, we're gonna do something in class. There's gonna be some measure of accountability. I don't take attendance, and the in-class work is not intended to be attendance. It is to reward you for doing something. So if you come to class and you don't do the activity, you don't get the points just for taking up a seat. So you have to do something. Sometimes we introduce projects. So the line that you see up here, data collection, that's a project that we introduced this past fall. I'll tell you more about that later if we have time. I do have homeworks. The thing that I tweaked and experimented with this year is I added, sometimes we do a series of quizzes, like we pepper quizzes throughout the exams. But what I did instead is that really does consume a lot of time. So in one semester, we had an assessment structure where we had 4 exams and 6 quizzes, and it was completely exhausting because we don't use multiple choice. So the grading was just over the top. What I did try this semester was this thing, I called it a quiz, but it was actually half an exam. And so they did this in the second week of class, the end of the second week of class. I gave them their first exam, and it counted. But the idea was to get you used to what the exam structure is going to look like and get a feel for how you're going to be asked to deal with questions. It's a lower stakes relative to the other exams. It's not going to count for as much. So now you have a chance to adapt. And if that strategy that you used for studying for that exam didn't work out for you, now you know what the questions are going to look like, and you can change your strategies accordingly. So, all right, my toolkit includes 3 basic things that I like to use in class now. Clickers, how many of you use clickers? About pretty much everyone is using clickers or close to. Clickers are great. I also use Carbonless Notebooks. I'll tell you about that in a second. And this third thing that we just started using about 2 years ago, whiteboards, mini whiteboards. So groups get a whiteboard and a pack of markers when they come in. So let's talk about each of these and the affordances of each of these. So clickers are probably the ones that are most commonly used. Lots of folks on campus are using clickers. And these are fantastic for getting really rapid feedback and for maintaining that engagement. So you want your students to be doing something all the time. You want them to be thinking and minds on about what's happening in class. So they're terrific for that. They're super easy to use. There is some sound pedagogy that underlies a good use of clickers. So typically a series might be you pose a question to students, they answer that question individually. You can choose to either share the outcomes with the rest of the class or just to look at it alone as the instructor, engage, looks like they got this, we're going to move on, or wow, we really have some work to do. And then you can organize the students into groups and let them discuss and try the question again. So that technique that's outlined there by the boxes on the right is described in Eric Mazur's book, Peer Instruction. So there's an entire manual that's basically written describing effective pedagogy around the use of clickers. So I like them because they're also spontaneous and on the fly. The way that I like to use clickers is not necessarily to always have my questions pre-planned. I have several that are pre-planned, but often in the course of discussions in class, students will say things or give me responses to questions that I hadn't anticipated. And so I also use a surface so that I can write on the slide, and we can create questions as we go. So I like that spontaneity and flexibility that I get from clickers. So we can collect a couple of divergent ideas from the class, design a quick question, and assess how many students are aligning with this way of thinking versus this way of thinking, and take a vote and make a mini assessment at that moment and decide what to do based on the data. However, clickers are a little bit constrained, right? So you're a little bit locked into sort of a multiple choice format. However, if we have time, I'll show you some different, more innovative ways that you can use clickers to do something completely different than a multiple choice question. but they're a little bit constrained in terms of the question type that you can ask. So for that reason, we've also incorporated things like Carbonless Notebooks. How many of you have ever used these in class? Not many, but this is why they're great. So if you want students to do a written response to a question, you want them to actually write out a sentence or a paragraph, or maybe do a drawing or sketch a graph. This allows them to do that sort of an assessment in class that you can't do on the clicker. So the Carbonless is, I'm old enough to remember carbon paper, and I'll bet some of you others in here might be able to remember carbon paper as well. But the idea here is there's no carbon layer here, but there are two sheets that are together, so the students write on the top sheet and it makes a copy underneath. So if I want to assign some questions in class or ask them to do some drawings, they can do that. They can peel off the top sheet and they turn that into me, and I can use that to give them credit for their in-class work that day. But they also have a copy. And because they have a copy of the work that they did, and because we're going to go back the next time we meet in class and give them feedback based on what I see in the writing that they turned into me, that's one piece of work that I don't have to turn back to the students. So we just collect it, we score it, and we file it. It doesn't have to go back to the students. So that makes life really simple. Questions about that? Because my third tool serves a very similar purpose. I mentioned we just started using whiteboards in class. It serves the same function as the carbon paper, and I might be willing to give up Carbonless the next time I teach. Students are accomplishing the same thing with whiteboards. So what we did is Diane actually went to Lowe's and she convinced somebody there to sell her big sheets of the whiteboard material and to cut it for her in very specific dimensions. And now we take a stack of these with us to class on another luggage cart that we haul with a bundle of little packets that have 4 different colors of markers in there. And every group picks up a whiteboard and a pack of markers when they go get seated, when they come into class. So the groups can organize themselves and they can do work on the whiteboard. And this semester I experimented with Google Forms. And so we have students now, once they've completed the task, made the drawing, done the graph, they snap a picture with their smartphone and they upload it to a Google form. And this is actually way easier than what it sounds like it would be. So I was impressed at how simple it actually was and how well it really worked. And they really like this because now they're using their phones for good and not evil in the class. Anything on that? Or anyone want to? Actually, I'd love to hear if you guys have other clever ideas or ways that you've innovated in the class for doing similar kinds of work. Other tools that I'd like to add to my repertoire.
Well, not to put in a shameless plug, but the next meeting,
yep.
Terry McElhenney and I are going to be talking about how we use D2L to essentially do the same thing.
Okay.
And so you were asking about alternatives to these folders, and it's just a different way of doing things, but we don't use paper in our classroom. We don't have paper and folders, but we use D2L to do something like this.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Is there a drawing utility?
So the way
live drawing.
The way that we handle that is the students just have a blank piece of paper or a paper with some scaffolding on it, and then they draw and write on that and use their smartphones to take a picture of it and upload the picture into D2L. And now I don't have to do my thing next time, right, Corey? I'm off the hook.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Other ideas?
Is this then graded by the ULAs or?
Yes.
Yes. And is there then feedback that the students can see their points? Or
yes.
How? Okay.
Yes, all of that. So all of the in-class work, the ways that I leverage the undergrad assistants is all of the in-class work I let them grade completely. And by grading it, usually what we're prioritizing here is that students invest in effort. A lot of the times the questions that we ask or the things we ask them to do, I know they're not all the way there yet. And so it would be unfair if I actually assessed for correctness or quality. What we're looking for is progress and looking to see where are you developing your understanding and what still needs to be worked on. So we evaluate them for effort. And so what we do is often for the daily work is just a simple scale, like a 1 to 3 scale. We give the students a 3 for the in-class work that they do. If they gave it a reasonable effort, they completed all the questions, they did what they were asked to do. We give them a lower score if it looks like they skipped out, if they turned in a picture of a squirrel, or, which actually did happen, and that's why I'm saying that. They got a point, though, because there's a really great picture of a squirrel. But the LAs can assign those points to that, enter the scores, and maintain a grade book in D12. Cool.
Do you post solutions, or is there any way for the students to see what their work should have looked like?
Yeah, so often if we do something that is, so I don't post rubrics for everything that we do in class. A lot of times these are really small things. I do post when we do clicker questions. A lot of times the clicker questions will elicit a discussion, and sometimes the clicker question will lead to a written activity or a drawing that we have to do. So I'll post the correct responses for the clicker questions. And what I get back, depending on how we've framed the activity or what exactly we've had them do, I will use the information that we see from the work that they produce as kind of a basis for judging what do we talk about next time. So if I ask them to draw a model of a chromosome and label alleles, and we take a look at 25 of those and find out no one knows what an allele is, obviously we're going to come back the next time. We're going to spend some more time unpacking that. And sometimes I will actually use their responses as part of the instruction. So I might take a screenshot or a picture of those and embed it as a photo in the PowerPoint, or bring some live copies and put them under the document camera and have students, I'll conceal the identity, of course. But let's take a look at this. This is a pattern that I saw. A whole bunch of you had the same issue. So let's talk about what's going on here and why that's not quite right. Mm-hmm.
So, is that on? In my class, I give a lot of writing assignments.
Yep.
Because I feel like it's very important that they practice that. Now, I don't have any assistants to help me grade, so it's usually time-consuming to grade, yep. And it's almost impossible to give any personalized feedback on each of those. So I try to give a general feedback, but a lot of students don't feel concerned. So I was toying with the idea that maybe I should have a peer review or peer grading, but I was wondering if you had any experience with that, because I had no idea how's it going to turn out. It could be a disaster if I start having students try to evaluate each other or give feedback to each other, or at least getting them involved into some critical thinking about the work that they produce.
So I have done some peer review with things like models and drawings. So I haven't done as much with writing. I don't know what level of class you teach.
It's senior class.
Senior class. So you likely have better writers than we do at the intro. Well, maybe you're shaking your head no, but maybe we could show you some stuff. Oh, okay. There are tools, and folks have developed mechanisms for, there's a technique called calibrated peer review, CPR. And if you Google that in Scholar, you'll find research publications on that describe how to enact that. And there are electronic tools to support implementation of CPR in your classes. I personally don't have experience with it, so I can't talk about it. I know that folks have used it very successfully, and those that have, worked with it over time to really develop it for their specific needs are quite fond of it as a technique. Absolutely.
So I was wondering, as you're preparing the next week's sort of set of activities, and maybe lecture part of the time and have them do group activities part of the time, and whatever.
Yep.
You're constantly having to make decisions kind of on the fly.
Absolutely.
Based on what you see.
Absolutely.
And so how much of the time do you leave as you're planning is totally unstructured? I've got to leave at least 15 minutes, 20 minutes, some amount of time, because I don't know what I'm going to see. And then, it's just for the plans. You're trying to plan the whole semester, and there's a certain amount of material you need to cover X because they need to know X for the class that they're going to take right after this, and things like that. I'm just wondering how you deal with that level of uncertainty on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis.
John's laughing because I know that he experiences the very same thing, and we've talked about these things before. So I don't have a single answer for you, but what I will say is that as I've taught the class over and over again, I learn more things about how long it's going to take to get through material. And every time you tweak the class, every time you tweak what you're going to do, you fix one problem and break another, right? And sometimes the new break takes more time than the old one, and sometimes it doesn't take that much, but it's always a learning process. So I feel like after having taught the class a number of times, I have a better sense for how long it's going to take to get some of these difficult concepts. And I've failed enough times that I know what things I shouldn't incorporate when I'm planning in the future. And I will say that over the years, progressively, I rarely add much. I might expand some things or increase the depth of something we spend time on, but most of my work is eliminating. Yeah, we're not covering the breadth of information that I did when I started. I went back and looked at the notes that I used for the same class 10 years ago, and I was like, oh my God, I can't imagine that we tried to do all that. So it's always pruning. Yes.
I was just going to add, as an alternative or an analog way to kind of use the clickers, one thing I've done is I've given each student a piece of paper that's got quadrants, and each quadrant is a different color and a letter. And so students can actually just hold up, you know, like green, and then you'll see like some green, some yellow, some red, to kind of get an analog way to look at the clickers or look at responses, so you as an instructor can gauge if they're getting it or not.
Absolutely.
Real quick, just by scanning the room. And those also work really well with the groups too, kind of as in place of a whiteboard, if you don't want to haul around the whiteboards, just letting them kind of hold up either the color, the letter, the number, whatever it is as well. So that's just an analog way that for people that are interested in trying clickers or aren't comfortable with the technology, that you can kind of do this similar type of thing.
Absolutely. I think that those are great techniques, and I've seen folks using those. The argument for the clickers, or the affordance of the clickers, is that it can be anonymous. So if you're holding up B, and you look around and you're the only one holding up B, then so that's the reason for the clickers. But I would say absolutely, that's a great substitute if you don't have clickers.
I have a question, and it may not be applicable, and if it's not, just say that doesn't count for, it doesn't apply. So I am, I'm actually crashing your party from Arts and Humanities.
I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you. So we have faculty in Arts and Humanities. I work for the Center for Integrative Studies and Arts and Humanities who have large courses. Not as large as 6 and 5, but 150, 250. Many of whom don't have TAs.
Right.
And I'm wondering, is that something that happens? Is there a possibility for you to have a class of 100 plus without TAs?
Yeah.
And then how would you maybe implement some of this if you didn't have the ability to have the LA or the TA assist in some of these group activities? If you can briefly offer suggestions or ideas.
So yes, you can do these things without LAs, but it's easier, of course, if you have LAs to help facilitate this. I'll share with you some other ways that we've used LAs also. When I started, the very first class that I taught for BioSci was 500, and I had no LAs. But I argued for one, and I got one LA to help me with the class of 500. So we did less. I was also novice. I didn't necessarily know how to do a lot of these things. I think that we've been successful in making the case that LAs are a really inexpensive investment for a lot of return. You can really leverage the time of an LA. They don't cost much. And I know we're all budget strapped and we all have no money. I know that. So, but in the grand scheme of things, LAs are far less expensive than a graduate TA by a long shot, and you can get a lot of mileage out of an undergrad. We also I've heard of faculty that have had volunteer LAs. So the LAs will volunteer to assist with a course and do some of these things for free. I don't like that arrangement because I feel like I'm abusing them in some way, but they're doing it for the letter of recommendation. So they aim to please. You know, they want a close relationship with a prof who can write a recommendation when they apply to med school. So they're happy to do that.
Tammy,
Kelly,
can I just add a comment too? Because I don't know if anybody's used this here on campus, but I've actually heard of some individuals who will use undergraduate students, and the students will actually take a credit, And the LA experience will be a credit that so they get additional assignments that are tied to it as a learning experience for them.
Do they have to pay for that credit though?
Yeah, they still pay for the credit, but it
I don't
counts
like
toward
that.
a requirement for them
That
as
seems
well.
so mean. You have to pay me to work for me. That just doesn't seem, yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, that's one strategy. But for a student who's...
But yeah, right. It's not just that they're just working on the class, it's they're getting some benefit out of it themselves as a part of being a part of a teaching and learning team, and then there's other things that they're doing with the instructor. So it's not just them working for you, they're getting some benefit personally that will help them with their future career endeavors.
Okay. Good. Anything?
One tool that I've used that's available to all of us that's really great for some of this, like getting quick feedback or grading like some discussion responses, is the bulk discussion grader functionality within D2L that was made by Nate Evans in the tech department. And that'll, like, if you have like a discussion question, it'll take it out of the tree format and do it and organize it by student, including like it'll put the students' posts and responses in the same question. So I thought that was a really good suggestion for your like peer grading thing. I've actually used it for that, where they needed to do some data interpretation, and then everybody needed to do 2 comments on everybody else's data interpretation. And then I don't know what they're responding to, but I can at least grade like with a quick like radio button 1.2 points if they gave like a reasonable critique of somebody else's thought. And I can usually grade like 150 responses in about 25 minutes or a half an hour using that tool. Because you can scroll through them rather quickly, and you're more grading for like, did they write something reasonable? So that's a cool tool that you can use.
Good, thank you. I do want to tell you how we're using LAs to help facilitate these exams, though. So, and then we can opt not to talk about the examples and have more of a discussion for the last few minutes. But so let me show you how we use the exams. So I've mentioned that the students are already in groups. And I also mentioned we don't do multiple choice in this class, so I've opted to do constructed response for all of the exam items. So a typical exam usually is in the range of like usually 4 to 6 pages, independent pages of questions. We leave white space for folks to do drawings and construct graphs and write things. But a couple of really just quick techniques if you choose to do something like this. And this took us a couple of years just to figure out what are the things that are the time-saving devices. So when we hand out the exams, we don't use staples. We don't staple the exam pages together. We paperclip them. And we also make sure that every page of the exam, so even if the stack is 8 pages, every page has a place for them to put their name and their group number and name, okay? And what that allows us to do is that when the students are finished taking the exam, they come to the front, and we have a table that's dedicated for where they're going to turn them in, and there's usually an LA that's there to make sure that they're collecting and making sure everybody has a name on everything. The students will then sort the exam pages for us as they turn them in. So we'll have a stack for page 1, a stack for page 2, and so forth. And what that does, and we've gotten better about strategically organizing the questions on the exam to allow this to happen, is we can bundle some very objective questions all together on the same page. So when that stack is turned in, now let's say page 1 has some very straightforward, no judgment required kinds of questions to grade. They have to build a graph, they have to fill in a table, they have to copy, what the DNA, the transcript is if they're copying DNA. So that can be given to the LAs, and they can score that. And then the pages that require more judgment can come to me. And this fall was the first time we actually had a graduate TA in the classroom, the very first instance. So now I have, maybe, reliably in the future. We're not sure if that's going to be sustained, but had the luxury of having a TA in the class to also help with grading. So those judgment things can come to us instead. So what we then do is that after everyone finishes the grading and all these papers are bundled in these stacks, and it helps to have these questions clustered together so that you can keep your mind mentally on the same assessment item. The LAs can then, we scan these so that we have a permanent record of what the exam looked like and any writing that we did on this. Because occasionally, an exam page may come back for a regrade, and occasionally those answers are not the ones that we got the first time around. So now we have a record of what we actually got the first time around. The LAs then also sort these by the individual student, put them back in the individual folder, and get them into the group folder box. So now the next time we come to class, the students can just pick up their exam. Everything's coming back to them. It's not shared. And you've all walked into classrooms where there's like 500 exams like spread across the table and the students have to go find theirs. So we don't do that. This works so much more nicely, more smoothly. And this process really saves a lot of time. I also wanted to mention that in this grading, we know that there are some rules about undergrads grading. That's why we reserve things that are extraordinarily objective. So there's little judgment required. We also leave room, and this saves a tremendous amount of time too, that if the students, the LAs, can grade items, and there occasionally are some things that are just weird and wonky, and even though it's supposed to be completely objective, they're just baffled at what to do. They can just make a pile of those. I don't know what to do about those. And then those come back to me. So instead of grading 200 of them, now I'm grading 25, and I'm just grading the 25 difficult ones, and they've got all the easy ones. The other thing that the LAs are really good at is even for those pages that are coming to me, and then again, this depends on the questions, sometimes the LAs are quite good at sorting them. Like they can see patterns. They can flip through a page of exams, 200 exam pages, and note that there are particular trends in the way that students answer questions. And if they're able to identify the trends, and now sometimes if we've done this for a while, we can tell the LAs what the likely trends are. If the LAs can start binning and sorting these into stacks that reflect trends, I can't tell you how much that expedites the task of grading. So I know that this is the good stack. So now my mind is in this mode of I'm expecting these to be good. And so I'm looking for key indicators and attaching the score. All these students misinterpreted the data set, right? So now I'm grading it with that lens, and that just saves a tremendous amount of time. So that's how we've really leveraged the use of LAs. And since there is that concern about did the LAs not give an appropriate grade, even for those subjective tasks, we have this tool that we've included in the class where the students can actually dispute a grade. But what we want to avoid is that circumstance, and I bet all of you have experienced this. You've turned an exam back and you've got this pile of students that are forming a line at the front of your class to quibble with you about how they were graded on some particular item. So we don't allow that anymore. If they want to dispute a grade, they have to fill out a form, and the form is available to them in D2L. They download this form, and there's a procedure that they have to go through if they want to dispute a grade. Before they can ask for a regrade, they have to consult the rubric, and they have to fill in this space here that is a justification for why they believe that they were graded inaccurately based on the information in the rubric. So this is not any longer regrade me, this is unfair, my neighbor got 2 points and I only got 1. We're not taking any of that. You have to consult the rubric, see what the criteria are for a correct response for that, and use that as the basis for your claim. So we're teaching argumentation skills here. What's your claim? What's the evidence from the rubric? And what do you want me to do? So, questions about that? That has dramatically reduced that problem. So everybody's mad when they get their exams back, right? They're all mad. They all want to kill you. But then they go back and they look at the rubric, and that gives you two things. First of all, they have to actually construct a reasonable claim for why they deserve a reconsideration. But the other is it gives them a cool down period. And that's really been helpful.
So sorry, it's not a question about this, but kind of as soon as you were starting to talk about the exams and whatnot, I was wondering, do the students have any individualized assessments besides D2L?
All the exams are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering because there's a spot for the group number and all that sort of stuff, so
The
I
group
thought
number
that
is just
they...
a way of identifying them because ultimately their exam that they did individually is going back into the group folder.
I see.
So that gives us, where do we file this after we grade it?
So I give a combination of take-home exam or homeworks that are graded and then in-class exam. But I found a pretty good correlation between the two. And I was wondering if you had any opinion about not doing any in-class exam anymore.
Not doing in-class exams?
Yeah. So, having everything take-home and it's just easier to manage, and it's paperless. I mean, I don't have assistants, so I can't, go through and sort and distribute and give feedback and all of that stuff. So D2L has been a great tool for that. But obviously, there's always the concern when they're home, you don't know what they're doing.
Right.
But I found that, when you ask them to write, it doesn't, having Google available doesn't really help them. So I wonder if you had any experience and opinion about those things.
I have given some take-home exams. Most of mine, I will admit, are in class. So most of them are during class time. But I have done some.
Correlation with those grades?
A correlation with the grades?
The question is that, are the in-class exams really necessary to assess students compared to just giving them homeworks?
I think that's probably more of a philosophical question, perhaps.
It's a number. If the scores are the same, then you get the same information out of take-home that you get from the in-class.
And I don't know. That part I don't know. I haven't actually done the analysis where I've looked at what is the take-home grade and does that mirror what they do in class. I think some students probably benefit from the take-home arrangement. Those students that particularly have a lot of anxiety about taking exams, they probably benefit there. But I haven't done that careful analysis to be able to say anything on the basis of any evidence for that statement. I have none. Okay, so we just have like 7 minutes left, is that right? So would you guys like to have chat, conversation, questions? Would you like to see some examples of cooler things you can do with big classes? Or I'm happy to accommodate whatever you'd like to.
I'd really like to hear what you see as the benefit of
Okay.
classes and
Okay.
I mean, that's you, but
Any other votes? Or yes? Okay. All right. I'll go through these really quick. So I'm going to do a very bad job of giving an adequate explanation. I think that some of the things that you can do, the innovative ways that you can engage the students in some kind of a task and leverage the utility of the big classes kind of organizes around the idea of you can increase the complexity of what you're having the students do, and you can engage the power of replication. So if you want to do something sort of authentic, if you want to have students involved in data collection, or if you want to have them involved in some kind of analysis or creating a simulation, that's where the size of a class can really be leveraged to an advantage. So I'll skim over this really quickly. This is an example of this is a fairly complex homework assignment that we have, and it comes in 2 parts. And it has proven really effective for getting across a very complicated principle. So the first part of the homework is conducted by individuals. The students do this as a homework on their own, and this task is organized around helping them to learn some of the principles of natural selection and concepts related to fitness of individuals. And fitness is not an inherent characteristic of individuals, but it kind of interacts with the environment. So your fitness is a function not only of your genes, but also the environment that you're in. So students get a data set and they plot relationships between a particular trait and fitness. And I'm not going to go through all the questions because I'm just going to try to make the bigger point. But this is a population of plants that the students are looking at. So the data is all coming from a plant population. What the students don't know when they get the homework is that different students get different populations. So they're all answering the same questions, but they all got different populations. So when you bring the students back and they come back with their homeworks, now you can organize the students either into their groups or into other like ad hoc groups that you create for the purpose of this task. And what they find out is that other people had different data than they did. So the second phase of the task becomes thinking more analytically about what's going on across a series of populations rather than just in a single population. And noting that the trends that you see when you compare different locations are not the same in all places. So this has been a pretty powerful way of leveraging groups and big sizes. A second way that we've used the power of big groups is to do some real experimentation in class. I haven't done this in a couple of years, I might go back to it, but how many of you know what I'm reflecting up here? Have you seen this before? So you know what this is, this insect? This is a termite. And termites actually have this odd behavior that they will follow trails of certain types of ink. And it's because some inks actually have a pheromone mimic in it that the termites will follow. So no matter what you draw on the paper, they will just follow these lines. So this is a very complicated thing, and I've done it with 500 students, and it gets really chaotic, but it's a whole lot of fun. We organize the groups, we give them tasks, because we need to make sure that they're staying on task, that things don't get too out of control. And if I dump all of the instructions on every single individual, it's too much to keep track of, and the students will just collapse. So what we do instead is different individuals within the group have different roles. So they're responsible for their role, and when you put them all together, you can affect this nice little experimental situation. So what the students do then is they have their different assignments, they're responsible for different components of the activity. The question that we're proposing, and this is authentic research that we're going to do in the classroom, is we want to know, do the termites prefer black ink? That's a simple question. So we converge, we have a discussion where we kind of converge on an experimental design, and the one that usually ends up emerging out of this discussion is, okay, you've got 2 colors of ink, draw one circle that's blue, one that's black, and we're going to drop the termite in the center of these and just see what happens. And you're going to do 5 trials of this, and the data that you're going to record is the number of times that the termite went to black, okay? So now here's where the power of the numbers actually helps, and you can teach something completely apart from scientific process. So when we're getting the feedback, the data that the students are going to be reporting is how many times out of 5 trials did the termites go to black. So instead of just having everybody vote it, and they're going to vote this in on their clickers. So A through D is going to be 1 through 5. And instead of having everybody do it at the same time, I'll call out a group and say, enter your number. So we call out a group, and one group says, well, we got 2 times. And then I'll call out another group, and they have a different result. And then I'll start phasing in, okay, if you're in this row, all the groups in this row, I want you guys to enter your scores now. And notice how my distribution is changing. So this is the other thing that we're paying attention to as the students are reporting the data. So now we're going to add the next tier of groups, enter your scores. And now we're getting something that looks close to a normal distribution. We're getting close to something like that. And what we find then is as we phase in like 5 to 10 groups at a time, is after we get up past some threshold number, and in this case, these are actually the real data. I didn't fabricate this for you. This is actually what we got in one instance of this. After we got past 25 groups reporting, the distribution didn't change. So then we can have this really rich discussion about what is the role of replication in science. And what would you have concluded if we had stopped the trial with only 2 groups repeating the design? How would that have influenced your interpretation of what the outcome was? So I thought that was really great, and it ended up being a much more successful outcome than I anticipated. It was a lot of balls to juggle at once, but it was worth it. We also do some things where we can simulate population genetics activities, and I know many of you have, if you teach bio, you've probably tried variants of this, but we can use props in the class in combination with clickers to do some population genetic simulations. So if you have a single gene that codes for a particular trait and you have 2 alleles of it, you can represent this by having 2 different kinds of candies that the students can hold in their hands. And we pass out genotypes at the beginning of class, and we configure this purposefully to incorporate a particular pattern or design in the class. And then we can, when the students have these candies in hand, what we do is we can have them vote in for the genotype that they possess. And what they're doing here is they're giving us numbers that we can work with, because what we're going to do is test a mathematical model for testing whether or not evolution is happening in the context of this population. So the students vote in, they generate these numbers, and we can do the math, we can walk through the stats to make tests, and then we can also play with the population. So we can have them do things like get up and mate with each other. So these are alleles. So we have the students all get up, and we show them how to effectively mate with their classmates and exchange alleles and recount the population at a later time. So there's a series of instances where we record, what's going on in the population, and they're making exchanges with the alleles and swapping them out in order to simulate what would happen if we have different kinds of circumstances or different events that are happening, whether it's random mating or sexual selection is happening. We always incorporate some natural disaster. Students love tsunamis, so we're always wiping out half the class with a tsunami and seeing what impact that has on the population diversity. And what we've just started recently, this is the last one, I won't say much about this, but I developed an activity in a lab where we had students doing some research on the campus trees and documenting phenologic change in trees on campus. And we're moving that into the lectures now. So this past fall, we had 400 students across 2 sections that were every week going out and sampling a subset of 200 trees on campus and documenting phenologic events. And if you don't know what phenology is, it's the pattern of change that you get at seasonality. So color change and leaf fall. So students are quantifying this. They're documenting it photographically by taking pictures and uploading them into the database. So we have the start of a large database that we intend to use going forward that we can then have the students query for learning how to do statistics, how to do simple data analysis, talking about data structures, and building onto the database so that we can compare one year to the next, or we can compare across species or groups of species to look to see what impacts we're seeing in changes of owing to climate or owing to microclimatic effects, like our trees on the south-facing sides of buildings changing later than those on north-facing, those kinds of questions. So,
I witnessed this project. I noticed the students.
You witnessed it? You saw the students out there taking pictures of trees. Yeah, we learn a lot of things. You know, there's a lot of lessons to be learned about effective data collection when we're doing this, like not taking photos of trees in the middle of the night. So that it's hard to quantify color when your tree's in the dark, but we learned a lot. So, and I'm happy to hang out if you guys have questions after, or I know some of you have to go to the next place, but I'm happy to hang out and answer any questions you have.